Well, we'll go ahead and kick this off. Good afternoon. I'm Brian Wallace with the Georgia Municipal Association. We're glad you've joined us today for this joint GMA Georgia Conservancy webinar, Facing Our Sustainability and Resiliency Challenges. We know all of you are busy and that your time is valuable, so we appreciate you fitting this webinar into your busy schedule. GMA is very pleased that the Georgia Conservancy has partnered with us on putting this webinar on. We value the Conservancy's expertise and that it has an interest in Georgia's cities being strong, vibrant, and prosperous. We hope to offer additional informational webinars on this topic later this year, so keep an eye out for that. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the GMA website. So if you all would please go ahead and put yourself on mute. We would appreciate that. And also please note that nothing said in this webinar is to be construed as legal advice or an official position of the Georgia Municipal Association. I'm now going to turn it over to our moderator, Georgia Conservancy President Catherine Moore, to lay the stage for the webinar and to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Brian. And if you're able to, we'll go ahead and transition over to the slides. And I'm going to talk through a few things, as he said, just to set some context for what you're going to hear. I'd like to offer my thanks to you all as well for being here. I'd like to thank our panelists, and I'd like to thank GMA for this partnership opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and say a few words about our panelists, and then while you're looking at their names, if you want to Google them or make note, I'm sure they're going to share their contact information. But we're thrilled with the diversity of folks and perspectives that we have on this small panel. And it includes Pam Knox. Pam wears many hats at UGA, and two that I find particularly interesting and relevant to today's conversation is the fact that she's the director of UGA's Weather Network, and that's, I think it's 86, 85, Pam, locations across the state that are collecting weather and climate data. So she's going to share some of that really interesting data with you today. And she's also the ag climatologist, so she's providing really important information to the #1 industry in our state. And those are located in many of the geographies that our audience participants represent today. So she's got a lot she's going to share with us. Courtney Wright is VP with Goodwin Mills Kaywood. I've had the pleasure of working with Courtney in a variety of settings over the years, and I consider her very much a water resources expert with some specialty, particularly in floodplain management and stormwater management. She's going to bring some kind of low-hanging fruit or good ideas for your thoughts and consumption this afternoon. And finally, we have Mayor Gerks, who's going to talk to us about some particular initiatives related to sustainability and resilience that he's leading through the unified government of Athens and Clark County. And in particular, maybe he's the best one to be speaking to all of us today as a former educator, because I think that's ultimately what we're doing today, is sharing some stories and hoping that we're giving you some information you can act on in your community. So next slide. It's always helpful, I'll go with that educator a thread of thought there, to give definition and a little bit of a 101 as to what we're going to talk about. We often find folks interchangeably using the phrase or the concept of sustainability and resilience, but these in fact are different approaches and different concepts. And so I wanted to define each of them for you today. So in a nutshell, to me, I think the simplest way to think about resilience or resiliency is that bounce back ability. And as it relates to a community, we'd like you to be thinking about how is your community positioned to bounce back from a minor or a major stress. Are you positioned to do so? Does it take a long time? Do you have the resources you need to do it? Or do you take on a stress and impact your community and you know, pun intended, weather that storm? So think of resiliency as your ability to bounce back. And, you know, when we think about that in terms of our communities, the importance is that we're minimizing those consequences, both the kind of everyday or month to month or seasonal stresses, as well as those acute shocks. And you heard us chit-chatting about weather and some of the unfortunate implications to Georgia communities here recently. So let's think about those concepts when we think about resiliency. Next slide. And we should also, let's go ahead and go to the next slide too, if you wouldn't mind, Brian. Thank you. So I'm sorry we've got a little wraparound that is strange there. Sometimes things look different on different computers and software versions, but I wanted to just park the thought with you all today that resilience and resiliency can be impacted by different types of threats, but those acute threats or stressors, those very sudden, perhaps infrequent, very dramatic things that impact our community. The sudden closing of a major industry, a major storm. So these can be both man-made as well as natural occurrences. And then these chronic things, is there something seasonal or with some regularity or cycle in terms of an impact, again, both man-made or natural to our community? And how can we be aware of both and prepare for both? And that's some of the information you're going to hear today. Next slide. And then finally, just a few more thoughts. Let me define sustainability. Again, we often see writing or hear people giving presentations and using these words interchangeably, but there's very much a difference. So we talked about resilience. That could be in your household, but we're talking about communities, particularly cities today, and your ability to bounce back. And sustainability is simply meeting the needs of the present without impacting the future to meet its needs. And so I've borrowed a definition there from the UN that speaks specifically to sustainable development communities, of meeting present community needs without compromising the ability of future generation to meet theirs. But that's a really simple way to think about it, is meeting current needs without impacting future needs of others. And while we see the phrase sustainability wrapped up primarily in terms of the environment, and I'm speaking to you as the president of an environmental or a conservation nonprofit, but it's so much more than that. And my background is as a community planner, so I think very much about people and our local governments, as well as I think about our natural landscapes. So I want to leave with you all the thought today that planning for sustainability and allowing sustainability to factor in to your ability to have a resilient community has very significant positive fiscal impacts for you all as a local government, social impacts and the positive as well for your community members and the households that comprise your communities, and certainly economic opportunities, both for you as a government and to recruit more businesses, but then for the individual businesses and households within your community, when we can lessen these stresses and be more sustainable in how we think about our departments and the resources that our departments use. So again, these are different concepts, but they do relate to each other. And I would suggest to you that a stable community, a community that's going to weather all types of changes over time, economic, population changes, community health impacts like so many of us have been through over the past 12 months, a stable community should have both sustainable practices and be building its resiliency. And so my final slide before I hand it over to our first panelist is just to share that these thoughts around resilience and sustainability, these are not solely environmental or conservation topics, and they are not just topics that a large city should be thinking of. As we look at these quick schematics, not really maps, but these schematics that represent different things happening across our big state, the point here is that the scalability and the applicability ranges across all of the government scales and sizes here in Georgia. And while we're pleased to be speaking before city leaders, it also applies to our county and our regional and our statewide government as well. So it's no thing for just a large community to think about its future resilience and sustainability, because every community of every size, wherever you are in Georgia, is facing some stresses, be they chronic or acute, and your mindfulness towards building some sustainability and resilience will help you all as local government leaders face those impacts as they come. So I'm going to transition now to our first speaker, which is Pam Knox. And the way that we hope this conversation will go today is Pam sharing some really important and interesting data with us at the big picture scale. Then Courtney is going to speak next and talk about some exciting projects that she's been involved with that I hope will begin to spur ideas of things that you can do in your community. And finally, Mayor Gerks is going to further distill and share some peer-to-peer learning examples as he talks about some efforts underway in his community. And so we'd like to leave you both with some inspiration, but more importantly, provide some data that we hope you'll follow up on, some project examples that we hope you'll follow up on. And also one last thought, you're probably doing many things in your community already that are building resilience. and also have a sustainability component to them. And you may not even recognize that that's the matter, that is another benefit of certain actions or policies, because you're doing them for very pragmatic reasons of saving money or building some redundancy or duplication within your system that's important. So it may awaken you to some efforts you're already successfully undertaking, and you should commend yourself for that leadership action. So Pam, we're looking forward to hearing from you, and then at the very end we'll have time for some questions.
All right. Well, it's great to be here with y'all. And it's my job to remind you of what we have seen in the past and what we're likely to see in the future, because of course a lot of historical information about what you've been able to do in your areas in the past depends on what the weather was or the climate. And in the future, of course, you need to know what that is as one of the many factors that you'll have to deal with over time. So I'm going to talk about climate trends. And I want to just start out by talking about what is climate. This happens to be for the Atlanta area. If you go to that website, you can probably pick a similar kind of graph for your own. You do have to sign up for a free user ID, or you can email me and I'll work on one for you. This provides what we call a thermograph, which shows the annual average daily temperature in that green bar in the middle. The reds show the extreme high temperature for each day, and the blue is the extreme low for each day for the period of record, and that's going to depend on your city. And then this one has superimposed on it the actual values for 2020. And it's pretty typical. You can see lots of ups and downs in the spring and fall. And in the summer, we have more similar weather from one day to the next. And that's, I think, pretty much all of our experience. The important thing to keep in mind here is that climate is really not just the average weather, but it's also the ranges, it's the extremes, and it's the cycles of what we experience from the atmosphere over the course of a year and over the course of many years. And really the averages aren't that important compared to the extremes, because the extremes are really what drives our risk. And so those are something that we really need to keep in mind. I wanted to remind you and remind myself that what you think happened to the climate really depends on what time period you're looking at. This is a picture of my husband, John, about 20 years ago, and our son, Evan, who was 6 at the time. And, their perspective on what's happened with the climate has varied quite a bit because of the length of time. The tree behind is 80 years old, or it was 80 years old until we cut it down. I went out and counted the rings. And then the rifle that John is carrying, which is an old family relic, is about 150 years old, a Kentucky rifle. And the inset there of a more recent picture of John and Evan shows that some things change naturally. We get a little grayer. Certainly Evan got a lot taller, and he's now in graduate school at Duke. But we also changed the environment. This is a picture from New York City. You can see the Empire State Building there in the background, and it's on the High Line. We add buildings to it. We changed the atmosphere around us. And so not only does climate change naturally, but it's also changing because of things that we're doing to it. This is one of the graphs I like to show. This is the Georgia state average annual temperature since 1895, which is on the left there, to 2020, which is on the right. That's the most recent year that we have a whole year's worth of data for. There's lots of interesting things in here, and I could talk about this a long time. But I think what you really want to notice for this purpose is that for most of us, I was born in 1958, so I'm 63 years old. For most of us, we've been in this period where the temperatures have been rising pretty tremendously over time. And there's a lot of year-to-year variation. When I talk to farmers, that's what they're interested in, because they have to worry about what they're going to get from their crop in the next year. But we have these rising temperatures that are going up pretty significantly, and there's no sign that that trend is going to change anytime soon. It's interesting to look at some of the older historical things, and we could talk about why those happen as well. But for most of us, we're living in this time period where the temperature is going up pretty dramatically over time, although there's still a lot of year-to-year variations. I think it's also important to keep in mind that the Southeast is not like a lot of the rest of the US. If you go to my home state of Michigan, for example, they've had a lot more warming than we have here. The Southeast is in what we call a warming hole. We have gotten warm a lot slower than other parts of the country. And there's a variety of reasons for that. One is a change from crops, bare ground crops, to more forest. And we've also had more cooling due to aerosols or pollution that's kept the sun from really hitting us with the full force of its energy. So when you talk to people in other parts of the country, they're going to have a different experience than you are as well. Since extremes are important for what we have to deal with as far as risk management, it's important to look at how the number of extreme high temperatures compare to the number of extreme low temperatures. If the climate was stable, you'd expect about the same number, but that's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is that we're getting a lot more high temperature records than we are low temperature records, and that's because of that rising temperature. And so those are important because people have to deal with those really high temperatures, and we have to talk about, you know, heat stress on animals, heat stress on workers, and all those things are important for dealing with the future climate. We're going to have to deal with more extreme temperatures. And it's really interesting to note that a lot of times it's the nighttime temperatures that are going up more than the daytime temperatures are. That's really related to increases in humidity and also in pavement. Humidity probably a little more than pavement, but certainly both of them are factors. That's important because if you can't cool off at night, your health is going to decrease because of that. Here is the similar graph for precipitation for Georgia. It's the annual average precipitation. And unlike the temperature one, you can see this one's actually pretty flat. Now, there's a lot of year-to-year variability, but we really haven't changed the total annual precipitation that much. I think one of the interesting things to note on here is that in the last 20 years or so, we've had a lot more multi-year low precipitation values. And I think that's really helped to contribute to the droughts that we've seen since I moved here in 2001. And so even though the average might not be changing, we are seeing some changes in how that's distributed over time. Again, you know, the Southeast isn't exactly like the rest of the country. The northern part of the country is actually getting quite a bit wetter. Instead of having more snow, they're having more rain, and the season is lasting longer. And so they're able to grow some crops. For example, in North Dakota, they didn't used to be able to grow, like corn. It used to be too dry, but now they have more moisture and they can grow those new crops there. Whereas we've been more dry, especially because we've had quite a few droughts in the last 20 years. One of the things to keep in mind that even though the annual average precipitation isn't changing, the way that it's falling is changing, and that's important for you. What we're seeing is that the days with 2 inches or more of rainfall, so that's a pretty good thunderstorm amount, are increasing by about 27%. That's important because that's going to affect your infrastructure. If you have to deal with heavier rains more often, you know, if you've got areas in your town where you're having flooding on a regular basis because the culverts really aren't designed properly, that's going to be more of an issue in the future. And we also know that since the annual average is not changing, it means we're going to have longer dry spells in between, which means we're going to see more droughts in the future as well as more floods. Here's a graph that shows the amount of time that we're in the drought. This is for Georgia, so the lower the value is, the worse the drought is. Again, starting in 1895 on the left and going through February of 2021 on the right. And you can see there's a lot of ups and downs. There's a period from about 1958 to about 1980 where we didn't really have a lot of drought in Georgia. That was also the period, if you remember back to the temperature map, when we're the coolest. And now that it's getting warmer, we're getting droughts more frequently. And you can see in the last 20 years, we've had more frequent droughts and we've had longer droughts. And so both of those are issues for water supplies. And that's something that y'all are going to have to deal with a bit more in the future. I think Georgia's probably about due for another drought again. I don't know if it'll be this year or next year, but there'll be one coming, and you need to start thinking about that. So how does the changing climate affect cities? Well, more temperature, higher temperature means more energy demand for things like air conditioning, although there'll be less for winter heat. Heat stress is going to be a problem for outdoor workers and folks that live on the street, or people that just can't afford air conditioning. So that's something that's going to be a continuing problem. You may have to have more cooling shelters in the future. As the growing season increases, there's going to be more chance of heat-related illnesses. There'll be more mosquitoes and other pests, and there's going to be stresses to health providers to have access to enough water, especially during those droughts. That's something that's going to be an issue. And I know here in Athens, some of the hospitals have drilled their own wells so that they have access to enough water in case the water supply really goes down. The heavier rains are going to lead to things like increased erosion and the infrastructure challenges that I mentioned before. The drainage is just not designed. A lot of our infrastructure is pretty old. It's designed for a different climate than what we have now. And then the drought, increases in drought will lead to water supply issues in some places and the potential for, how are you going to do water conservation? You also need to keep in mind that cities do affect the climate as well. Even here in Athens, there's about a 10-degree difference between downtown Athens and the outer edges of our county on a really cold and calm winter night. We have an urban heat island here, and we're not even that big a city. Of course, in a place like Atlanta, the urban heat island is much bigger. So small cities can have some difference too. The inner parts of the cities heat up more during the day, and they stay warmer at night. And that's will affect the people that live in the cities differently than the people that live on the fringes. City emissions can increase the pollution, and they also cause more rain. There's more rain in Norcross up downwind of Atlanta than there is in Atlanta itself, because the pollution that comes out from the city helps to form rain clouds, and that helps more rain to form in the areas that are downwind of the cities. Of course, we have old and poorly designed infrastructure that leads to more flooding, and also not just the roads, but also housing. The housing in low-lying areas is certainly something that's going to be more frequent. And then growing populations use more energy, water, and food, all of which contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. So all those things are ways that cities affect the climate. So I'm going to wrap up here so we can go on to the next speakers. The future, I think, holds a lot of challenges for us with all these problems like the warmer temperatures, the more heat stress, more potential for drought and floods. But at the same time, we also have opportunities because we have a more aware populace than we used to, at least in some places. They might be willing to pitch in to improve this and to reduce the impact of cities on climate. And a lot of the solutions to these problems can also save cities money. And I know money is always a concern when you're running a budget. So if you can do something that will save you money and do the right thing by the environment as well, then that's a win-win. And we might be able to also share that information with other parts of the country and other parts of the world. And so I think that's a real opportunity for us as well. I'll just put this contact information up here for just a minute. You're welcome to contact me. Probably the easiest way is email pknox@uga.edu. And look forward to hearing from the other speakers now. So let me get out of this and stop sharing and move on.
Thank you. And as we transition for Pam, Courtney, I think we did plan this, folks, but we didn't do a practice run. But I think there's some great segues from all that Pam just shared to what Courtney and Mayor Gerks are going to share with us. So I'm excited to hear Courtney begin to help us think about how do we distill some of those challenges and opportunities that Pam set up by sharing the historical data, and these kind of notes to you all is what you have in mind as to opportunities for projects and areas of investment or awareness, Courtney. And you're on mute. Just if you need to, I know that always happens and somebody does it. I'm glad it was you, not me.
Unmuting myself. It's hard. I can't seem to make the, are you seeing my PowerPoint right now, or do I need to share that still?
It's there. It's not in presentation mode.
Got it. Okay. I think we should be there now. Well, thank you so much, Catherine. I really appreciate being part of this panel and for the opportunity to talk about some of the resiliency work that's going on in the state. I think sometimes it can be a little overwhelming to sit and listen to all of the potential issues that cities and counties will be facing in the future as it relates to changing climate. And what I really want to communicate today as part of my presentation is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, as you put it earlier, and there's a lot of things that you can be doing now that can help you prepare for some of these extremes and stresses that you'll be facing in the future. Pam mentioned in particular impacts to infrastructure, and I know that managing, maintaining, and improving infrastructure is one of the major functions for local governments, and that's something that I think, or I would recommend, really deserves attention now. And a lot of you probably are spending a lot of time dealing with infrastructure issues, but there is a lot of vulnerability within your infrastructure systems, and I'm talking about transportation, water resource systems, emergency facilities, as well as just the built environment within your community. All of this infrastructure is potentially vulnerable to climate extremes and climate change in the future. And one of the most important things that you can do right now is just understand what infrastructure you have and how it might be vulnerable. And you can see here a list of some of the projects that I'm going to talk to you about today, but all of these really share that component that it's about understanding infrastructure vulnerability. So I'm going to feature a couple of projects from around Georgia. One is Garden City. I think Ron Feldner is on this call right now. He is the city manager, was involved in this project. And they embarked around the same time as they set up a stormwater utility on performing an inventory, a GIS inventory of their stormwater infrastructure. And for those of you, some of you who have NPDES permits, you may already have this information, but this is a really important start. Understanding your drainage infrastructure is the first step to making sure that it can function during some of these extreme events. Here's what some of the things that we found as we walked around and did some of this work looking at their infrastructure system. You find that a lot of it is not functioning and really could use some attention. This, of course, is one of the benefits of having a stormwater utility, because you can have a dedicated revenue source to actually begin addressing some of these issues. But certainly having a full database of where those problems are is the first step to planning on how to address them. Garden City went a little bit further and actually did a hazard risk and vulnerability assessment for a lot of their infrastructure systems and local government programs. And this allowed for them to begin to better understand the vulnerabilities within these infrastructure systems and what kind of risk they were actually facing. This was a process that was that they followed that was an ICLEI-based process, and went through, and based on this program, they were able to update their emergency operations plan and their hazard mitigation plans with some of these results. We're currently working with Chatham County here in coastal Georgia, and not all of the projects I'm going to feature today are coastal, but I am in Savannah, so a lot of my projects are coastal. But we're working right now with Chatham County and the city of Savannah on the sea level rise study. This was a project that was funded through the Coastal Zone Management Program through a CIG grant. And this allowed us to look at the drainage system and how it might be impacted by high tides. Some of you might have heard the term king tide. Those are the highest tides of the year. And how those high tides might continue to affect this drainage system over time as sea levels rise. So we're looking at how does high tide affect it now, and how will high tide affect it in the future based on various sea level rise projections. You can see this map right here. Those are all stormwater. The red is stormwater infrastructure that is projected to be impacted by high tides within Chatham County by 2100. Right now, we're moving forward with this project, and we're actually looking at roadway vulnerability analysis and understanding, based on the elevations of the roadways throughout the county and the city, how those roadways might be subject to flooding during high tides as sea level continues to rise. This is just a basic graphic to demonstrate how the drainage system can actually be impacted by sea level rise. And part of the problem is both that as sea levels rise, that water can flow back up through the drainage system. But the bigger problem really is that once the sea level is above where that stormwater drainage outfall is, and then you have rain on top of that, it can seriously impact the drainage system's ability to convey any drainage. So it becomes essentially non-functioning. And so looking at that and understanding and beginning to mitigate that within the stormwater drainage system through projects like this is a project on Tybee, but this is a tide gate that allows Tybee to retain some function within its drainage system even during high tide events. Both that Tybee project as well as the Chatham County project are part of the overall floodplain management program for these communities. This is a map right here. This shows communities in Georgia who participate in the community rating system. This is a program that's offered by FEMA for communities that participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, and it rewards communities that actually engage in additional beyond baseline level projects and programs that improve flood resiliency within these communities. They're awarded points, and much like fire ISO, people are probably much more familiar with that concept that your community receives a rating 1 to 10, 1 being the best, and as your rating improves, you receive discounts on flood insurance policies within your community. So you can see here, this shows those communities both that participate in it, those are blue and green. Communities in red are communities that have a high number of flood policies but are not yet participating in the community rating system. This is a great win-win because it helps you improve your flood resiliency within your community, reduce your flood risk, but also saves flood policyholders money. Glynn County is also currently engaged in a resiliency project. This is for shoreline resiliency in Glynn County and understanding where erosion is happening. Erosion is happening on all various types of shorelines within the county, both because of sea level rise, but also because of boat wakes, because of development and stormwater runoff, and for all sorts of other reasons, and understanding where that erosion is happening and developing projects to help address that is what this project is all about. Camden County, actually, the neighboring county to Glynn County, just received a grant to actually engage in a resiliency plan as well. This is really to understand where sea level rise is going to impact this community. You can see here, this is a map of St. Mary's under a sea level rise projection of about 2 feet. And you can see that even at that low level of sea level rise, you're starting to see impacts along the edge of the community where there is some development, as well as low-lying areas, which is that green spot in the middle of St. Mary's. So part of this project will look at opportunities to identify where that vulnerability is and begin to preserve property where possible to allow for the migration of both the sea level and also the nearshore habitats as they migrate inland as water rises. Everybody here on this call who works for local government is probably engaged in hazard mitigation planning at some point. Every county is required to have one. And this is a real opportunity, if you don't already, to engage in a process that is designed to help you identify and mitigate vulnerabilities within your community. These happen every 5 years. This is just an example of McIntosh County because this is the one I was most recently involved in. But this is, these mitigation plans are increasingly beginning to look at mitigating hazards that are related to climate issues. There's also a new process called the Disaster Recovery and Redevelopment Planning. I know that the state has several model processes for this, and this really takes hazard mitigation planning a step further to look at how are you going to, as Catherine said, rebound back after an issue, after some type of major stress happens in your community, both during the event, directly after the event, and for a long period of time thereafter. How does your community recover, and what's the plan to do that? I can turn now to the one project I was going to talk about that is outside of coastal Georgia, because I know there's a lot of folks on this call. This is the Metro North Georgia Water Planning District's Utility Climate Resiliency Study. This is a document that the district put out, I want to say it was 2015, that is a guidebook for utilities, water, water, sewer, and stormwater utilities, to look at their infrastructure and their vulnerabilities related to all different types of climate change, both related to temperature, to droughts, to increased rainfall intensity, all the different types of potential projected climate changes. And it is a process that is designed to help utilities come up with a plan to make their systems more resilient. We recently went through this process with Henry County Water Authority, and one of the recommendations that came out of that process was we identified some manholes that were within the 100-year floodplain that could be potential candidates for elevation, so that would reduce potential inflow during periods of high rainfall and flooding. So of course, we did talk a little bit about the National Flood Insurance Program, but I think this is important to mention because this is a program that really does deal with resiliency to flood and flood risk. And these are the three main features of that program. And I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, your communities participate in the National Flood Insurance Program, which means that you maintain flood maps, that you have a flood ordinance that you enforce that has minimum standards, and that allows you then, or that allows properties within your area or your city or county to be able to be eligible for federally subsidized flood insurance. Once you participate in this base level program, then you are eligible to participate in that community rating system program that I spoke about earlier, that has rewards communities that go above and beyond the minimum level requirements. And you can see here, this is the ISO classes that I was talking about and how it can actually result in premium reductions for insurance policy carriers within your community. So that ends my presentation. You can see my contact information here. If you have any interest in any of those projects and you want to learn a little bit more about them, please feel free to reach out. And I will turn it over to Mayor Gerks. I believe you're next up.
Thanks, Courtney and Pam and Catherine. I actually feel like you did a great job teeing things up. It's almost as if we had planned all these presentations together. So I am, as we have gotten accustomed to share my screen here.
And Mayor, while you're pulling that up, I want to remind everybody we do have time for question and answer. So certainly be getting your thoughts together for any of the panelists or myself or Brian or any GMA folks that are on the call, and get ready to drop those into the chat. Otherwise, I've got some questions I'm going to ask the panelists. But thank you, Mayor.
Great. Well, everyone, I just want to begin just setting a little bit of context about Athens-Clarke County. And then make a couple introductory remarks before I talk through some of the opportunities we've been able to avail ourselves of here in Athens. Just to set the stage, I know many of you are familiar with the community, but we are a unified government like Macon, Augusta, and Columbus. So we have the powers of a city and county. That certainly benefits us in terms of some infrastructure development. We don't have to have intergovernmental agreements with a separate city or a separate county. And so I just always have to underscore that that's a real functional benefit of being in the unified government environment. And we're a population of 130,000, but as the smallest geographic county in the state, we also are very residentially dense. We're the 6th most dense county in the state of Georgia, which means we've got to try and do a lot of good work with a relatively small amount of space. And I'll say that while I'm on this presentation, it really is the great staff of the county. We've got a 1,700 member staff who are the real experts in all this. So I'm just sort of the delivery vehicle here, but we've got some fantastic local folks. And if you have questions about some of the particular projects and you'd like to connect to the real architects of them, I'd be glad to help you with that. And also have to give a lot of credit to my fellow elected officials on the current county commission and also county commissions past who really have kicked off a lot of this work for the last several decades because many of these things didn't start overnight. And I guess that's my final note, which is that, this is continual work. It's not a one and done. There's no silver bullet. There's no magic wand that Hogwarts provided to Athens-Clarke County to do this. And that ultimately, my experience is that the things that I'm going to talk about here in the next few minutes are best done layered together. So they're not just sole activities, but they're activities happening in tandem. And so one of these key activities here in just the last year and a half has been our commitment to make a complete transition with our own energy use and to settle for certain in policy that we're going to obtain 100% of our energy from clean and renewable sources by 2035 for our built environment. We have a sort of complementary goal of having our vehicle fleet completely renewable by 2050. The reality of any organization, public or private, is you buy a vehicle fleet and you intend to maintain that vehicle fleet for 15 or 20 years. So we certainly recognize that our vehicle fleet is going to lag our built environment in terms of sustainability and renewability. And this work is being guided with a community advisory board, like I know many of you have for sort of other public functions, whether that's your planning and zoning board or other resident committees. And so that brings a lot of, no pun intended, energy to the table. And we get some community feedback on a continual basis through that group. And then we're also putting in place a community energy fund that's going to draw from franchise fees to support low-income neighborhoods in efficiency gains. The reality is we've got a lot of large in-town neighborhoods that were built out well pre-World War II, and these are some of the most inefficient homes in any community. And also some of those are owned by people of not many means. And so we want to make sure that we're specifically targeting those lower income and historic homeowners in the Athens community. In our commitment to renewables, we've put a couple of big eggs in the basket, so to speak. We began with our SPLOST program in 2011, funding renewability. And the biggest project that came out of the 2011 bucket was a 600 kilowatt solar array at our waste treatment facility that's going to offset half of the energy used at that facility. If you live in the water and sewer world, or you live in municipal or county life, you know that one of the biggest energy draws that you have is waste treatment, fresh water and wastewater treatment. And so this is a big step forward. And I always want to make the point that, even though sometimes this gets framed as innovative work, it really is well integrated into the nuts and bolts of what we do every day. In the same way that any evolving public sector organization gets new professional competencies at the table, we certainly have around sustainability, but it's been no different than, putting our meetings up online, or having a web-based application portal for people who are submitting architectural plans for new structures. It's just part of the natural evolution, and has not been that difficult. And in fact, pertinent to the last bullet here, has also, rather than cost us money, saved us money. One of the things that we do every time we're about to run a new SPLOST package is we have a fiscal note that's attached to every proposed project. And so we always, of course, have proposals for shiny, beautiful new buildings and attractive, welcoming new parks. But those kind of projects come with some maintenance and operation costs. Counter to that experience, though, our renewabilities commitment actually comes with reduced costs to the government. So the $15.8 million that we've allocated to renewability in our new SPLOST package that just began in 2020, it's actually going to save us $1.2 million a year in operating costs countywide. So it's got sort of the reverse, very positive fiscal effect for us. Another thing that we've taken advantage of, and I talked about sort of residential density, is to really look at where people are living. Because you know that in any cityscape, if people have to drive long distances, if people are spread out, you're creating new costs and new challenges for your community. Increased road maintenance, increased vehicle consumption and fuel consumption. And so we've really targeted residential density in places where we know people can live and work and play and send their kids to school, so that we really do see reduced impacts community-wide. And this was another area where we kind of put our money where our mouth is. And so we approved nearly $45 billion for mixed income housing. And that's going to include a dramatically increased node of density just adjacent to our downtown, where, in an area that currently 500 people live, we're going to be seeing more than 1,500 residents in this reimagined area. And that's going to benefit those individuals in terms of their life experience, but it's also going to benefit the community because we're creating greater resiliency by putting people next to the things that they already want to access. Connected very closely to that, we've really been keen on expanding our transportation options here in Athens. You see the graphic of what's going to be the iconic Firefly Trail Bridge over Trail Creek, which is immediately adjacent to the North Oconee River. If you're a music fan, this was the location of the first REM Records back cover photo shoot from early 1980s. And so this is going to create a more walkable environment and a more bikeable environment, so people don't have to use single occupancy vehicles as frequently to get around. And so with planning like this, we have north of 12 miles of multi-use trails right now. Within about the next 5 years, it's going to be north of 20 miles of multi-use trails that we have to our community. And again, very targeted on connecting people and places to those opportunities for kind of a better life and getting to the things you want to get to. We also have been continuing to work on expansion of our transit plan between Athens, Clarke County and the University of Georgia. We together represent the second highest ridership of any transit program in the state, just beyond MARTA. And so in the next couple of years, what we really expect to see is a reduction in fares, incentivizing the use of transit, and increase in frequency by making sure that on our most highly traveled corridors, instead of having buses every 30 minutes or 60 minutes, we're moving to having buses every 12 or 15 minutes, just to make those more viable and usable and practical options for people. We also have really focused on green space and forest land preservation. You probably all know, and as we've heard in kind of the earlier presentations today, forested areas and natural areas are really important if you want to avoid or diminish the heat island effect. And they also have some benefits around aesthetics and clean water. And so it's interesting because sometimes people will paint this portrait of having environmental concerns arrayed against economic concerns. But as I've engaged with business and industry, whether it's Caterpillar, who moved into the community a decade ago when I was on the county commission, or Boehringer Ingelheim, who's recently expanded their research and development facility here, or a company like RWDC that makes a plastic substitute from used vegetable oil. All of those employers have said, we liked Athens because Athens was a good place, an attractive place, and a fun place for our employees to be. And so I always want to make that point when people say, well, God, you're taking land off the tax rolls, or, you're keeping this land from prospective development. I'll always counter that and say, listen, we are really targeting development, and we're also targeting our environmental preservation opportunities. So fortunately, through the great work over, again, a couple of decades, we now have 20% of our land that's permanently protected. Some of that is through purchase by the government, and some of that's through regulation. We feature on all our streams a 75-foot setback buffer, and so that's created some additional opportunity for protected land. And these activities and others have meant that we've got north of a 60% tree canopy cover achieved countywide. And so that's going to do a lot of things around resiliency, not only reducing that heat island effect, but as folks much wiser than I in this area have informed me, one of the things that you get when you get great tree canopy is you also get great root intrusion into the ground. And that means that you're soaking up and you're retaining more water in your community rather than sending that off downriver and downstream. And we've made a big recent purchase and move around water quantity and water quality. Just last year, we purchased a large quarry, and it's going to allow us to hold about 4.5 billion gallons when it's full in a little bit more than a decade. And that's going to more than triple our current storage of water. I'll share with you that I came into policymaking life as a county commissioner in January 2007, just in time for the 07-08 drought. And so it was front and center to me that rivers that usually you can kayak down became essentially mud paddies. And we don't want to have that experience again. And a great environmental benefit of finding offline storage like this is that you're not damming up a river, you're not damming up a large creek or stream, and thus impacting that waterway. And what we'll be doing in this environment is we'll be pumping some fresh untreated water in when the rivers, the two rivers that flow through Athens, the North and the Middle Oconee, are at peak flow. And we'll also be reusing some water for those economic development interests that don't need potable water. So many industrial facilities simply need water for cooling purposes. They're not using it for, washing agricultural products or the like. And so this is really going to extend our capacity, we imagine, for more than 100 years. So again, none of these exist in isolation. And I really do think we just have seen the tip of the iceberg in terms of the things that we can do in the community. Again, we've seen these as net positive, both economically and environmentally in the community, and certainly glad to be part of the conversation after this. But if you have any questions that follow up, this is my cell phone number, 706-369-9457, and you contact me by email as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so we can continue the conversation.
Mayor, thank you so much. That was just a beautiful circle back to kind of where we began this conversation, and a great reiteration of what we hoped today would be about, which is some sharing of information, some highlighting of some exciting projects or policies, and some places to begin. I think Courtney, put it, you can see a list of things, or you hear some facts in a presentation, you can be overwhelmed, but in fact, there are some really straightforward, low-hanging fruit opportunities to do things we're already doing, but do them more frequently or slightly differently and have a big or an outsized impact. So thank you for that. We've got a few minutes for questions, and I want to make sure that I cover one or a couple that are coming in the chat, but I'm gonna start back with where the mayor just left us, this concept or this concern about just drinking water and water for industry, so water accessibility. And Pam shared with us in her data that we are looking at more frequent in cycles and longer droughts. And many of us, as we were opening up the conversation just moments ago, were just chit-chatting over the kind of the issuance of an opinion on the water wars. And so, Courtney, we heard about a really exciting but a really high dollar and kind of big flashy project that the mayor discussed that's going to help Athens, Clark County be more stable and secure in its water resources future. But could you give our participants, our listeners, an idea about maybe just some water efficiency measures, or cite an example of another community that is thinking about some other, we might call it smaller dollar, smaller scale, but no less impactful water security opportunities?
I think probably most communities, one of the most important, elements of being resilient, I think you said it, was being efficient and making sure that your water system is as efficient as possible in identifying projects that way. I think most people probably on this call who have water utilities go through an audit process every year. It's a requirement now of your water withdrawal permit. And going through that process and determining where you have water loss, whether it's through old meters, whether it's through old infrastructure and old buildings and plumbing fixtures, whether it's through just unaccounted for water use, identifying where those inefficiencies are, and then having small targeted projects to begin to identify that can go a really long way. I mean, and a lot of times, especially people who have permit limitations, that can extend the lifespan of your ability to withdraw water under your current permit for a long time.
Thank you for that. Anyone else? Don't let me curtail folks that want to add to that response. All right, a couple of more. I want to watch our minutes. We want to keep our commitment of just being in an hour. And so, Courtney, I'm going to pick on you one more time, and this is really, this is really impactful. I know on the coast, but all our communities in Georgia have some of your residents on septic versus, you know, a closed system sewage treatment approach. And the question in the chat is, with these increasingly heavy rain events that Pam, that we're aware of anecdotally, even Pam has confirmed, yes, they're happening. You know, are we aware of some updates to septic designs or some other type of programs that are looking at working with that situation for individual property owners?
Are you asking me?
Yes, ma'am.
That's a great question. I don't have, and I know that there are many people that are aware of that being a problem, and that there are efforts, at least here in coastal Georgia, ongoing efforts to inventory septic systems, understand septic systems, and come up with recommendations for maintenance of septic systems. And you know, obviously that's not necessarily specific to climate change, but it is something that was necessary before. And as you put more stress on those individual systems, certainly it's going to become an issue later. I don't have any specific expertise in septic design where I could talk to what types of designs or how can we better design these systems in the future. I do know that it's a struggle because a lot of times it is a state-run program, and local governments often don't have a lot of direct input over how septic systems are designed or maintained. So it makes it a challenging environment to address, but certainly absolutely something that people need to be thinking about.
And I'll offer too, you know, I'm not a septic tank expert, but, you know, the compounding, the challenge there that Courtney mentioned, but why it's worth digging into and looking for some of these resources is, of course, how that then impacts your water quality. And then we have perhaps, you know, you've got some readings or things that are turning a local stream into non-compliance for whatever it's, you know, it's categorical or determined use. So it's not just that it's, I think the mayor used the analogy that it's pieces together that are impacting the whole or can solve a problem, but it's not just that this is a problem for individual property owners, but then you might have a larger water quality problem to your community. So it's no small thing, and that can certainly come back and haunt you as a local government leader. One thing I want to ask the mayor about, and this is in the chat as well, and we'll have you answer this, and then we'll pivot back to Brian Wallace to close us out, is there's a question about the recent House Bill 150 that was one of we've seen over the legislative sessions the past few years, a couple of attempts at preemption by the state government on different matters, but this one 150 was particular to energy sources and the ability of local governments to determine their preferred or keeping a more diverse set of energy options. And the question is, you know, how has or will that HB 150's adoption impact Athens-Clarke County's energy goals?
That's a great question. You know, I talked a little bit about our own infrastructure, but we really are working actively with the community to be a partner on private sector projects. In fact, right now, we've engaged with the sort of business and industry community to talk about their own sustainability goals and how we can be mutually supportive. And we certainly like to have that same stance with the residential environment. As probably a lot of people on this call know, HB 150 specifically prohibits local governments from the opportunity to designate some properties as non-available for something like natural gas, say a petroleum product, you know, fossil fuel. You know, we would like to be able to incentivize the best and most energy efficient and the cleanest energy sources possible. And so it's frustrating anytime the General Assembly preempts those movements. You know, we don't think this takes all the tools out of our belt, but, you know, we certainly worry about the slippery slope and the opportunity that there may be something else we're prohibited from doing next year. You know, whether that's, you know, greater insulation efficiency, for example. You know, we're already in an environment, you know, as you know, Southern Company and Georgia Power kind of are the primary energy provider throughout the state, where we're hemmed in relative to some other states in terms of even how we can use solar. And so having a more expansive environment for renewables and clean energy is something that we want to hew toward.
Thank you for that. And I know that's a complex issue, right? They're all complex, but I know there were cities that had, hit a spectrum of perspectives on HB 150. So thank you for sharing, your particular community's reflections on that, Mayor. And Mayor Ford, your question in the chat, I'm going to connect you with Courtney so that she can answer that for you. But since we're right at time, I want to hand things back to Brian Wallace to, to kind of thank. We do hope to host some additional educational offerings under this umbrella topic in the future. Look for those. And Brian, what's the best way for folks to get you feedback if they have a topic that they want to hear about in the future, or otherwise contact you or get additional information?
Yes. Again, thank you all for being on the call. I'm trying to share. I was going to try to share my email. I think I hit the wrong one. Just you can get hold of me at bwallace, BWALLACE @gacities.com. We would love to hear from you about other topics that GMA could, sustainability and resiliency topics that we could bring to you, either in conjunction with the Georgia Conservancy or other partners. We really want to do that. So please let me know. I'll probably send an email out to the folks that were registered for this meeting. We'll have my contact information in there, and we do want to hear from you. I want to thank all of our panelists and Catherine Moore from the Georgia Conservancy for participating, the Conservancy for being a co-sponsor of this today. And again, we thank you. We'll have the contact information for all the panelists in the email as well, so you can get hold of them. And we hope to get this webinar online, and I'll have the PowerPoints available online, but I can also email those to you all as well. So otherwise, thank you again for being with us today. We appreciate you sticking with us, and hope to do this again sometime. Thank you.
Thank you all. Good afternoon.